Hello everyone, and thank you for being here. My name is Paul D'Ambrosio, and I teach Chinese philosophy at East China Normal University in Shanghai, where the Collaborative Learning Project, 四海为学 Collaborative Learning Project, is based. Today, I want to welcome you to a book discussion. This is our 57th event, and we are here to discuss Professor Philippe Major's Chinese Iconoclasm, Textual Authority, Modern Confucianism, and the Politics of Anti-Tradition in Republican China. We have three really wonderful people here today to talk with Professor Major about his book. They include Adi van Denstock from Ghent University, Abigail Xiaowei Wang from East China Normal University, and Selusi Ambrogio from the University of Macerata. Our chair today is Alice Cambi, who is also from Ghent University. It has become a tradition here at 四海为学 to give younger scholars a chance to be part of high-profile academic events by inviting them to take part as chairs or discussants. So if there are any younger scholars in the audience who wish to be part of future events, please email me. This event today will be 2 hours total and end promptly at 8 p.m. Beijing time. Before getting things started and handing them over to Alice, I want to say a few things about the 四海为学 Collaborative Learning Academic Forum. The 四海为学 Collaborative Learning Project hopes to distinguish itself from some of the less productive conventional practices in contemporary academia. As posted on our website, we are not interested in male peacocks, in jerks, or in any form of egoism or self-promotion. We hope to curb all types of aggressive and look at me, I'm smarter than you, or don't I know so much, and similar attitudes sometimes found in academic exchange. We might even go so far as to say that we hope to be somewhat of a counterbalance for the negative attitudes often found in so-called blind reviews. While there is certainly a time and a place for anonymity, or at least the appearance of anonymity, in academic communication, there should also be just as much time and place for speaking to one another in more congenial and community-forming settings. The neologism 四海为学, which was created by Robin Wang, is a play on 四海为家, and we hope to keep this idea of 四海为家at the foreground of all of our events. The 四海为学 Collaborative Learning Project seeks to accomplish these shifts in orientation during academic exchanges by encouraging productive communication, humble discussions, real questions, and responses that are open and honest. We hope to foster environments where people truly learn from and with one another. So we want to once again thank all of the author and the discussants for being with us here today. Our chair is Alice Cambi. She studied philosophical studies at Bologna University and graduated with a master's thesis on the reception of Kant's notion of Ding an sich in the late 19th and 20th century Chinese philosophy. She is currently working as a first-year PhD researcher at the Department of Philosophy and Moral Sciences of Ghent University. And her project deals with Kant's theoretical philosophy, his philosophy of language, and Mo Zongsan's critique of Kantian epistemology. We're very happy to have you here, Alice. The screen is yours.
Thank you so much, Paul, for your introduction, and good afternoon or good morning, depending on your time zone, to everyone. I'm pleased to introduce to you the author of today's book, Philippe Major. Dr. Philippe Major is a lecturer in philosophy at the University of Lancaster. He works on the history of Chinese philosophy with a particular focus on the 20th century. His work adopts an interdisciplinary resources such as sociology of philosophy, discourse analysis, and intellectual history to address issues related to epistemic hegemony, alternative epistemologies, alternative modernity, and the exclusion of Chinese traditions from the philosophical curriculum. Today, he will present his first book, Confucian Iconoclasm, Textual Authority, Modern Confucianism, and the Politics of Antitradition in Republican China, which was published by Stanley Press in 2023. The book provides a new account of the emergence of modern Confucian philosophy in Republican China that challenges the assumption that Confucianism is traditionalist by nature. Philippe is also currently working on his second book, and which is particularly interesting because it seeks to enlarge the recent debates on the exclusion of non-Western philosophy from the philosophy curriculum. Welcome, Philippe, and thank you for being here. The floor is yours. You have 15 to 20 minutes for your presentation.
Great. Thank you so much, Alice, for the introduction. Thank you, Paul, for the invitation and the introduction as well. I'll try to keep my ego aside as much as possible. I couldn't share more your views on this point, certainly. So yeah, I'll try to give an overview of the book in 15 to 20 minutes. It's been a bit of a challenge to prepare the PowerPoint and sum up everything in the short period of time, but I hope I managed to do so. So let me share the screen. Can you all see the presentation? Perfect. Okay, good. So this is the book, as Alice mentioned. It's based on my PhD thesis that I did in Singapore, supervised by Tan So Hoon. But I rewrote it quite a bit during the postdoc period when I was in Switzerland in Basel. So it's quite different from the PhD thesis, and it's published open access, so you can just download it online. You don't have to buy it. I'm sure SUNY Press wouldn't be happy that I mentioned that, but yeah, it's freely accessible thanks to Swiss funding, yeah, which is quite generous. Okay, so as Alice mentioned, so the main contribution of the book, I guess, is that it provides a new account of the rise of modern Confucian philosophy in the Republican period. So probably the best way to explain what this new account is to go back to the sort of standard account of modern, or what is often known as New Confucianism. And the standard account usually is that it represents some sort of attempt at preserving tradition in opposition to the iconoclasm of the Mayfort movement. And there's some truth to that account. I'm not going entirely against it. But I am trying to give a new perspective on modern Confucianism by arguing that actually the most successful modern Confucian philosophy is nearly as iconoclastic as the Mayfort movement was. So that's my first argument. And the second one is that Mayfort and modern Confucianism are both engaged in what I call a politics of anti-tradition. So there's a lot to unpack here. So what do I mean by politics of anti-tradition, and in what way can we think of modern Confucianism in the 20th century in the Republican period as engaged in this politics of anti-tradition? So what I want to do in the following minutes is to try to answer these two questions. Now, first, try to see in what way Mayfort is engaged in the politics of anti-tradition, and then talk a little bit more about Confucian iconoclasm. So I hope I don't go over the 20 minutes. Alice, do let me know if I do go over. I shouldn't go over too much, certainly. So let me start with just a quick definition of anti-tradition, which I provide in the book, which is partially taken from Edward Shields, although it is my definition. And essentially, I define anti-tradition as a tradition that opposes all other traditions on the first hand, and on the other hand, a tradition that presents itself as the only means to achieve a final liberation from the realm of the traditional. No? And there are various anti-traditions that we can think of. One of the most prominent, certainly in the modern period, is what I call the anti-traditional discourse of modernity. And I can highlight maybe three different dimensions of this anti-traditional discourse of modernity. This won't come as a surprise for anyone who has studied the discourse of modernity, certainly, but essentially these 3 points are: first, that according to this discourse, modern history is both teleological and unilinear, in the sense that there's really only one way that history takes, and this one way leads to one and, no, to one telos. And this means that if there's a spatial difference between, say, Native Americans and French, then this spatial difference is interpreted as essentially temporal in character, meaning that the Native Americans are behind the French and they need to catch up, no, according to this discourse of modernity, no? So that's the first dimension. The second one is that, history's telos represents a disworldly emancipation as opposed to a form of Christian eschatology. And this involves humanity breaking free from the shackles of tradition, no? Oftentimes, and also breaking free from various forms of heteronomy, so that at the end of history, oftentimes what is conceived of as emancipatory is a form of human autonomy. This is not the case in Marxism necessarily, but here I'm focusing on human autonomy because it plays an important role, certainly in my story about Confucian iconoclasm. And then the final point is that in order to enter into modernity, you have to perform a radical break from all of these traditions that are limiting the human potential for liberty, no? And what's interesting, I think, is that even though this discourse served as a colonial and imperial ideology historically, it was quickly adopted by members of the Mayfort movement. And a good example of that is one of the leaders of the Mayfort movement, Chen Duxiu. Now, in the late 1910s, in his articles published in New Youth, Chen famously argued that essentially, when compared with the achievement of the white race, there is a difference of 1,000 years in thought between China and the West. So it's clear here that Chen adopts a teleological view of history, And if you read this article in full, then you'll get a sense of how much he also thinks of history as leading towards an emancipatory telos, and also how he thought that in order to achieve this form of emancipation, you had to break free from China's so-called feudal traditions, no? Now, the question is, why is it that Chen Duxiu adopted such a discourse that is so close to the anti-traditional discourse of modernity, especially that it served as an imperial or colonial ideology, right? And my answer to this question has to do with the historical context. Now, in the Qing dynasty, if you wanted to achieve intellectual and social distinction, then you could pass the examination system. But with the abolition of the imperial examination system in 1905, the rules that codified intellectual and social distinction had to be reinvented. And in the 1910s, you see the universities are really taking over the role that was previously held by the imperial examination in terms of codifying the rules of intellectual distinction, but still it remained unclear who would succeed in codifying who would have access to the faculties at the university and who would have access to intellectual capital in the 1910s. And it's in this context that I argue that Chen Duxiu and other Mayfort intellectuals used the anti-traditional discourse of modernity to establish new rules of intellectual distinctions, which helped them achieve epistemic hegemony, essentially, in the discursive milieu of the time. And they managed to do that first by presenting themselves as the really only legitimate group who stand on the side of modernity and liberty, and also second by marginalizing any alternative position by presenting it as essentially feudal. And Chen Duxiu does that particularly well in his opposition to Kang Youwei, whom he argues is just a representative of feudal Chinese traditions. So this is what I call essentially a politics of anti-tradition, also a discourse that makes use of iconoclasm in order to achieve epistemic hegemony, monopolize intellectual commodities of high value, such as liberty and autonomy, and essentially reshape the intellectual field of the time around themselves. No? So this is what I mean by the Mayfort politics of anti-tradition. Now the question is, of course, what does this have to do with Confucian iconoclasm, right? So let me say a few words about this. Essentially, my main argument is that Confucian iconoclasm attempts to challenge the epistemic hegemony of Mayfort by reshaping Confucianism into an alternative anti-tradition to that of Mayfort. So an anti-tradition that wouldn't be Eurocentric, but that rather would be rooted in Confucianism. Now, how does Confucian iconoclasm do that? Well, it does that by borrowing quite a bit of anti-traditional discursive tools from their Mayfort opponents in order first to oppose all other traditions, and that includes, of course, the anti-tradition of Mayfort, also present Confucianism as really the only means of achieving a final liberation from tradition. So modern European culture is no longer conceived, of course, as the main means to achieve this final liberation, as in the Mayfort movement. And finally, there's also a desire here to attempt to monopolize Confucianism in Confucian iconoclasm. And I make this argument with respect to two texts. Of course, there are different ways in which modern Confucian texts answer to the Mayfort movement, but I argue that these two texts use two different discursive techniques in order to provide an alternative to the anti-tradition of Mayfort. And the first text is published by Liang Shuming in 1921. It's called Eastern and Western Cultures and Their Philosophies, 东西文化及其哲学, published in 1921, based on a number of lectures that he gave in Shandong the same year. And essentially, in this text, I argue that Yang Shuming uses teleological history in order to provide an alternative anti-tradition to that of Mayfort. And the second text is by Xiong Shili, the famous text called New Treatise on the Uniqueness of Consciousness, 新伪世论, that was translated by John Maycam a few years ago. I'm dealing here with the 1932 edition, so the classical Chinese edition of the text. And I argue that Xiong Shili borrows the trope of individual autonomy partially from his Mayfort opponent in order to provide an alternative anti-tradition to that of Mayfort. Yeah, so these are the two texts that I deal with. I want to say a few words about each of them very quickly before I conclude. So let's first begin by Eastern and Western cultures and their philosophies. So on the slide here, you have a sort of overview of the text's view of history. So essentially in the pre-modern period, you have Chinese culture, Western culture, and Indian cultures that are evolving in parallel ways. So if it wasn't for Western imperialism and colonialism in the modern period, essentially these three cultures would have simply never evolved towards the same goal. They would have evolved parallelly to one another, essentially. But in the modern period, these three different cultures become three different phases of a single unilinear, unilinear model of history. No? So essentially in the first period of modernity, you have Western culture that becomes predominant, essentially because it plays an important role in trying to solve the material issues of humanity, issues that relate to clothing and food and lodging, essentially. These are the kind of issues that can be resolved by adopting an attitude that is linked to Western culture, according to Yang Shuming. Then once these material issues are resolved, then the central issue of humanity becomes the social issue of social cohesion, harmony. And at this level, Chinese culture is the best way to solve these issues. And finally, at the very end of history, the main issue that humanity faces is that of human suffering. And at this level, Buddhism becomes the most important means to solve this particular issue. So essentially, Yang Shuming sees the telos of history as essentially a form of Buddhist enlightenment. No? Now, the question is, what is Chinese culture here in this model? Now, what is the kind of Chinese culture that Yang Shuming thinks will be revived in the second period of modern history? And here he really doesn't mean that it is the contemporary culture of China in the beginning of the 20th century that will be revived. In fact, he has a very negative opinion of that culture, quite similar, in fact, to that of his Mayfort opponents. What he means here by Chinese culture is really Confucius and his philosophy of life. And according to Liang Shuming, essentially, Confucius's philosophy of life is essentially teaching us to simply follow our natural intuitions. So if we follow these intuitions, we will always act properly. Yeah. And essentially, one has to free oneself from the limitations imposed from traditions in order to be able to live that intuitive lifestyle that was promoted by Confucius. And why is that? Well, essentially because Chinese traditions never truly followed, never truly put in practice the philosophy of life of Confucius. So what everyone calls Confucianism and what the Mayfort members attack is not, in fact, true Confucianism. It's a travesty of the philosophy of life of Confucius. So that's why Liang says in this quote here that Chinese culture was essentially shaped by the dregs of history and by inflexible rules of conduct. A quote that, frankly, could have been written by Chen Duxiu himself, no, in terms of its iconoclastic content. So according to Liang Shuming, essentially nobody has truly understood the meaning of Confucius. Some have come closer, people like Wang of the Taizhou school, who is part of the Wang Yangming lineage, if you will, has come closer to understanding what Confucius meant to say, but he never fully managed to do so. And this suggests that Liang Shuming, the author of the book, is the true first Confucian since Confucius himself, if you will, no? This is, of course, implied in the book. It's not like Liang Shuming claims to be the first Confucian since Confucius, but it is implied in his view of history, certainly. Okay, so this is the first book, and I'll get back to what this means in terms of transforming Confucianism into an anti-tradition in just a moment. But before doing that, I want to say a few words also about the new treatise on the uniqueness of consciousness, which in this case uses the discursive trope of the autonomous individual who is no longer defined by its outside in order to reshape Confucianism into an anti-tradition. And according to the text, every person is born with a pure inherent mind, a benxin, and with the birth of the body, the inherent mind becomes gradually hidden from our view as we start to distinguish between the self and the other, between the thinking subject and the object of thought. And the mind that makes these particular distinctions is known in the text as the habituated mind, or the xixin, which is language that Xiong borrows from Yogacara here. And the goal of self-cultivation for Xiong is not to cultivate the sprouts that are rooted in one's benxin, as you would think if Xiong had followed Mencius, for example, but rather the goal of self-cultivation is to go back to the inherent mind as it was at birth, essentially. So return to the very beginning of the process of the birth, the process that is initiated by the birth of the body, if you will. No? And the ultimate goal here for Xiong is that the mind should realize that it's not distinct from the universe. And according to Xiong, the universe is in a process of constant transformation. No? So and that means that the universe is sloughing off the past so that it no longer lingers. So to fuse with this process of endless transformation of the universe, the mind also has to do the same. Now it has to flow uninterruptedly. Here I'm quoting from the second quote here. The mind has to flow uninterruptedly through constant renewal and a complete absence of abiding with the old. So this is why the text portrays tradition and even learning as limitations that are imposed on the mind's ability to reconnect with the universe. So essentially one has to unlearn everything in order to retrieve one's inherent mind. And the only exception for this rule are the Confucian books, which can help you to sort of get on the path of self-cultivation that will lead to retrieving your inherent mind. But the problem with the Confucian books of the past is that they lacked systematicity. So they became incomprehensible essentially to most people in the modern period, with the exception of Xiaowei, of course, who understands the Confucian classics very well. And in fact, in this quote, Xiang presents his book as providing its readers with the final truth about both Confucianism and Buddhism, but he provides this truth, he sort of provides an account of this truth in a format that is both more systematic and much more clear than any other Confucian text in the past. No? So you get a sense here that what the text is trying to do is to subsume the truth of Confucianism and Buddhism, if you will. Okay, so these were the I've tried to summarize the whole book here in a few slides. Now, what I want to do is just say a few words about how the discourse of both texts enables them to reshape Confucianism into an anti-tradition, essentially. No? And remember that in order to have an anti-tradition, you need two criteria. The first one is that, well, you need to oppose all other tradition. No? An anti-tradition is a tradition that opposes all other traditions. And you see that certainly in the case of Yang Shuming, in a sense that he rejects all Chinese traditions as deviations from the philosophy of life of Confucius. He sees certainly some value in Western culture, but only insofar as it can fulfill basic human needs. And he also sees value in Buddhism, although Buddhism is so ahead of its time that actually Yang Shuming discourages the practice of Buddhism in Republican China. And in the case of Xiongshi, he opposes all traditions as limitations that are imposed on our ability to retrieve our inherent mind, as we saw, no? And the second criterion for there to be an anti-tradition, I realize I'm already a bit over time, is that right? So I'll quickly finish this slide, and I had another one, but I'll skip that one. I'll just finish this one if that's all right. So essentially, yeah, the second criterion for there to be an anti-tradition is that this tradition needs to be presented as the only means to achieve a liberation from tradition. And this is certainly the case of Yang Shuming, according to whom the philosophy of life of Confucius is natural, and therefore it's in direct contrast with cultural traditional ways of life that limit our potential for liberty. And it's also the case for Xiongshi, who presents Confucianism as really the only means to achieve a liberation from tradition, in the sense that the teaching of former Confucians can show us the way towards a liberation from tradition. And I also argue that both texts attempt to monopolize the anti-tradition of Confucianism. Eastern and Western culture does that by presenting Yang Shuming as the first and only true Confucian since Confucius. And the new treatise does that by arguing that it is essentially the new treatise is the only text that can provide its readers with a clear exposition of the entire truth of Confucianism. No? So in short, what the texts are doing is to try to marginalize the Mayford group by arguing that the only tradition that can bring about a liberation from the traditional is not Eurocentric modernity, as in the case of the Mayford movement, but rather Confucianism. So as I mentioned, I had another slide about two different types of counter-hegemonic projects. Maybe we can discuss that in the Q&A, but essentially I argue that although Confucian iconoclasm seems to represent a form of intrinsic counter-hegemonic project, whereby Confucian iconoclasm will be using the rules of the hegemon in order to marginalize the hegemon, here meaning the Mayford movement. I argue that ultimately the goal of the Confucian iconoclasm is also to change the very rules of social distinction, of intellectual distinction, also by presenting the Confucian sage as the ideal to follow, essentially, if I put it very briefly. So I'll end here. Thank you for your patience. Yeah, that's Judith Butler. I didn't have time to get into that. So I'll end here. Thank you very much for your attention, and I look forward to the discussion very much. Thank you.
Thank you a lot, Philip, for your very interesting presentation. And I'm sure during the Q&A we can come back to what you missed to say in the presentation. We can be slightly flexible about time because we have a little less participants than normal, according to Paul. So, well, we can go on. And our first discussion for today is Adi van den Stok. Adi van der Stok is a visiting professor at the Department of Languages and Cultures at Ghent University. His research has mainly focused on New Confucian philosophy and on the close interrelations between national, ethnic, religious, and cultural identity in this current of thought, as well as modern and contemporary Chinese intellectual history. His first monograph, titled The Horizon of Modernity, Subjectivity, and Social Structure in New Confucian Philosophy, has been published by Brill in 2016. He has also translated the work of several Chinese thinkers, and his work has appeared in renowned international journals such as Philosophy East and West, Asian Studies, the Tao Companions to Chinese Philosophy, and Asian Philosophy. More recently, he has begun exploring the role of ethnographic knowledge production in the global emergence of comparative philosophy through the lens of the late senior reformer Xiaowei. He has also begun collaborating with Dr. Lilith Lee from Vrije Universiteit Amsterdam on her study of the philosophy of Limbonkan. Welcome, Adi. Thank you for being here, and the floor is yours. The total time for your response is 20 minutes.
Okay, thank you so much, Alice, for your introduction. Thank you, Paul, for putting this together. I'm really happy to be here. So, yeah, first of all, Philippe, congratulations on your book. It's been out, I think, a year now, or more or less. And I really enjoyed reading it a lot, and can only hope that many readers will find their way to, well, the extremely interesting and nuanced, and I think also, generally speaking, very compelling arguments you make throughout your book. I must say I'm also extremely envious of your excellent and somewhat provocative title, Confucian Iconoclasm. For what it's worth, I've found myself using, or at least thinking of this seemingly oxymoronic expression quite on a regular basis since your book has come out. It's really resonated with me, and in general terms, I've been seeing a lot of examples, or many examples, of what you have so nicely and aptly called Confucian iconoclasm. Now, the reason I also like the title of your book so much is because it's not an empty provocation, let's say, or a cheap marketing trick. Once you start reading your introduction, it immediately becomes clear that you have a very well-defined concept of what this type of iconoclasm consists in. And I think throughout the book, you really managed to cast a very different light on these two thinkers, or more precisely, these two texts, which are at the center of your study. And I think you do this by bringing out some of the central contradictions and tensions in these sources, in these two texts, very well. And perhaps this also applies more generally speaking to the whole project of reinventing Confucianism in the context of modernity, let's say. One of the examples I liked the most personally was something I think you write about this on page 85 of your book, where you say, and this is a very quotable sentence, I think, that idealism served as the handmaiden of iconoclasm for both Liang Shuming and Xiong Shili. And maybe, I don't know, if you want to say a bit more about this to the audience in the time we have left, that would be good. I think you offer very compelling arguments for why we have this, what I think you call at a certain point, this quasi-Cartesian tendency towards separating the mental from the physical in the work of both of these thinkers. I think it's entirely correct and very timely that you point towards this Cartesian tendency, in the sense that it very much goes against the standard image of Confucianism, or maybe more generally speaking, the general image of Chinese philosophy many people have, that it's all about holism, about immanence and the overcoming of all sorts of dualisms. You also make clear that this Cartesian tendency, and again, if you want to comment more on that, please do, that this is quite hard to square with, Xiongshili's almost neurotic emphasis on the fact that the noumenal and the phenomenal are supposedly inseparable. Something else that really caught my eye was in your reading of Xiongshili and Xinwei Shiluan, that you combine your analysis of the overall ontological outlook of this work, which is the focus of attention for most studies, that you also combine this with an analysis of Jung's attitude towards self-cultivation, which I think is a part of the text that many people gloss over, maybe because it's quite technical, in the relation between his notion of self-cultivation and his more general ontological position might not be so obvious. And I think this was really a specific point where I found myself in complete agreement with you, and well, had a completely different view on the matter as well, which I hadn't really thought of myself. Okay, so to get the discussion going, I wanted to ask you a rather general question concerning let's say, the historical origin and also the scope of what you've identified as this anti-tradition, so this form of Confucian iconoclasm. I had the impression that although your study is focused on these two influential figures, or on these two texts, to be more precise, you are at the same time treating them as, well, paradigmatic cases of a broader phenomenon in Chinese intellectual history. And in that sense, I suppose that you would expect to find many more instances of Confucian iconoclasm, or Confucianism as a politics of anti-tradition, as you call it, in the work of other related thinkers. And I think this is the case, by the way. Now, the focus in your study lies on the Republican era. You accord a very central role to May 4th discourse, and how this discourse determined how Confucian thinkers such as Yang and Xiong positioned themselves. But I think there's also earlier developments to hark back to. So I'm specifically thinking of the figure of Xiaowei here, because, well, in my view at least, he might be the first, or at least one of the most influential and certainly also radical Confucian iconoclasts in modern China, for reasons that I think are well known to most people. So there's this radical narrowing down of which texts still count as canonical. There's a radical rupture in Kang Youwei's thinking between what you call Confucianism as history, and Confucianism as value, as something of transhistorical value. There's a repudiation of most forms of historical Confucianism as deviations from the true Confucian Tao. And maybe also not unimportantly, there's this very strong claim of sagely authority as well on Kang's part. So you probably know that he dubbed himself the Sage of Nanhai, and was also often referred to as the modern Confucius, in contemporaneous sources. So I think he fits the bill quite well of what you described as Confucian iconoclasm. So I suppose my question to you would be how you see the connection, if any, between the figure of Kang Youwei and the kind of Confucian iconoclasm found in the work of Xiongshili, Yang Shuming, and maybe other thinkers as well. And connected to this point, do you think that the project of Confucian iconoclasm is, well, still an ongoing one, in the sense that many contemporary efforts towards reinventing Confucianism also fit the same logic of textual authority and anti-tradition, which you analyze in your book? So yeah, I would love to hear your thoughts on this. Thanks.
Great. Thank you so much, Adi. Yeah, that's very thought-provoking. And your reference to the figure of Xiaowei is very just, I think, also in the sense that, well, it links to the last question that you had also, which is about the ongoing existence of Confucian iconoclasm, perhaps in a sense that you have, of course, the return to Xiaowei today, that is also one of these attempts to return to a previous figure and try to erase what happened in the meantime, in a sense, which is very similar to what I would argue Yang Shuming is trying to do by returning to Confucius and erase everything that's in between, if you will. And in that sense, yeah, the mainland New Confucians or the Kangdang group are trying to do with Xiaowei what Xiaowei did with Confucius, in a sense, right? In terms of elevating him as a sort of sagely figure that can be reappropriated in the modern period and interpreted at will, if you will, also, no? So I think Confucian iconoclasm, there are two levels, I guess, in which we can argue whether the kind of Confucian iconoclasm I discuss, whether it is sort of something that is unique to the Republican period, or whether it is something that takes place at different times in history. On the one hand, I think the sort of discursive technique of iconoclasm is something that happens throughout Chinese history. No, I think the very Wang Yangming is a good example of a thinker, for example, who tries to also go back to the origin, let's say, or even, there's something in Wang Yangming to the effect of achieving enlightenment single-handedly without the need to rely on the classics, which is certainly has iconoclastic implications, if you will. No, I wouldn't say that Wang Yangming is quite iconoclast to the level of Yang Shuming and Xiongshili, for example, but certainly there are iconoclastic potentials in there that, in the case of Wang Yangming, are clearly used in opposition to the centrality of Jushi and the centrality of Jushi in the Ming period. No, and you see various times in history in which there is an attempt to sort of challenge the historical account of a tradition in order to go back to its origin. And that's not specific to Confucianism. In fact, Alan Cole, who was a teacher of mine in Singapore, in fact, has a book called Fetishizing Tradition that compares Buddhist and Christian attempts at returning to the origin of a tradition and subsume it by partially by deploying iconoclastic discursive techniques, if you will. No, so I'm not sure that this would be so. In a sense, if you think of it in that way, in terms of the discursive technique of iconoclasm and the ideal of return to the origin of tradition, let's say, and trying to subsume the authority of that origin of tradition in your text and establish your textual authority in this way, then it sounds like something that is very widely used throughout Chinese history, but also human history. On the other hand, I think there is also something quite unique now to Confucian iconoclasm in the Republican period, and that's why I focus so much on the Mayfort movement, because I see Confucian iconoclasm in the Republican period really as an answer to the claim by the Mayfort representatives that the main way to liberate yourself from tradition is really through a sort of Eurocentric understanding of culture, really, no? So there's also something unique there. And that speaks also to what you said about Xiaowei, in the sense that I think you're right that Xiaowei could also be presented certainly as a Confucian iconoclast, and perhaps the first modern Confucian iconoclast. That's been a question that has been haunting me for quite some time, frankly, whether if you present Xiaowei as the first iconoclast, then that might marginalize the Mayfort movement in a way that, you know, challenges the centrality of Mayfort in my own account. Having said that, I think that what Xiaowei is trying to do is also different if you, of course, situate Xiaowei in his own historical context. I think his appeal to new text, the new text school, in order to return to Confucius as a sort of uncrowned king, is really rooted first in his opposition, first in his position at the periphery of the Chinese empire, no, in the south. He's trying to challenge, I think, those intellectuals who are located in a more central position by appealing to the New Text School. And in fact, the re-emergence of the New Text School in the 18th century, in the Qing period, is linked to that, I think, attempt to, by local elites outside of the center, to challenge the center, no? So there's a bit of that, in fact, is not unique to Xiaowei, in the sense that there's a history of new texts, of the New Text School re-emerging in the Qing period. Of course, not quite as iconoclastic as in the case of Xiaowei. Xiaowei builds on that, certainly. And secondly, I think there's also an attempt in Xiaowei to appeal to a modernization of the political model, but in a way that wouldn't challenge the Confucian sort of Shi elite, no? That was prominent at the time. So he's trying to oppose the imperial examination system as it existed at the time, but not challenge, you know, of course, Confucius and Confucianism themselves. So I think the historical context is very different, if you will, although it's not that, you know, long apart. Of course, there's, you know, only, you know, a few decades separating Xiaowei from the Mayfort movement. But already, you know, Xiaowei doesn't have to deal with, you know, his opponents are traditionalists. They are not, you know, those iconoclasts that Yang Shuming and Xiong Shili are dealing with. So that's certainly, I think, one historical difference that is quite important. And on the other hand, yeah, you also have to keep in mind that, I guess, Yang Shuming and Xiong Shili are both keeping a safe distance from Xiaowei, precisely for the reason that Xiaowei becomes the main object of criticism in Chen Duxiu and other Mayfort thinkers. No? So they don't want to be associated with him. Certainly, Yang Shuming does that more explicitly than Xiong Shili, I would think. In his book, he is clear that, you know, I'm not following Xiaowei. I'm a modernizer, in fact, you know, and all of that. And that can be seen certainly as an answer to the Mayfort movement. And so, yeah, in a sense, I agree with you that Xiaowei can be portrayed as a Confucian iconoclast, but if you, the goal, let's say the social aim of that Confucian iconoclasm is very, very different, I think, in Xiaowei and in the Republican Confucians, if you will. Yeah.
Yeah, that makes sense. Maybe just one more small question. I mean, I think you're 100% right to emphasize the centrality of May 4th for Confucian iconoclasm. I wonder, though, whether people like Liang Shuming and Xiong Shili were not also at the same time responding to, well, the increasingly rare historical manifestations of Confucianism in the Republican period, by which I mean things such as, I mean, this was after the texts you studied were published, I think, but things such as the New Life movement, or more generally, you know, the if only rhetorical use of Confucian vocabulary or the figure of Confucius in Kuomintang ideology, for example. I mean, both of them also had extensive connections to Kuomintang members, if you look at their correspondence and so on. So they were certainly aware of those kinds of, if you want to call them, instrumentalizations of Confucianism. So yeah, maybe if you can comment on that a bit, and then I yield my time gladly.
Yeah, that's a central tension in the modern Confucians, the closeness to power to one, on the one hand, not only the Kuomintang, but also to the Chinese Communist Party for both Liang Shiming and Xiong Shili. I mean, they had close ties to Zhou Enlai and Guo Moro and these people during the Republican period, the PRC period, as you know now, you've written on that yourself in the case of Xiong Shili. But so there's a closeness to power, and on the other hand, there's also a desire to purify Confucianism from politics, no? And that's where idealism kicks in. I think that's the goal of idealism in both cases, is that they want to purify Confucianism from history, so that Confucianism is no longer perceived as an ideology of the state, if you will, no? So that also accounts for their issues with the sort of Kuomintang appropriation of Confucianism, if you will. That, of course, you don't have in the 1921 book by Yang Shuming, because it's a bit early, perhaps, but later on, certainly, and in also, you know, the second so-called generation of new Confucians certainly also followed that trend of criticizing the Kuomintang's appropriation of Confucianism. Yeah. I'm not sure I answered the question. There's something else I wanted to say, but it escaped me. Yeah, I'm afraid. But yeah, there's
That's
a
okay.
tension, because they all want to act as the shi, no? Also in a certain way. There's a sense that they want their philosophy to have a political impact as well, but they also want to purify Confucianism from the sort of from its traditional enmeshment with, you know, the imperial politics, no? So that's certainly a central tension that is in the text, and the idealism is precisely there to make sure that Confucianism is not associated with politics in their particular text. But also, you know, their Confucianism is also purely discursive, in the sense that they don't have much to say about rituals and things like that. No, so if you study classical Confucianism, you know, ritual is at the very core of it. Of course, you know, it becomes less and less central as you go on, perhaps in the history of Confucianism. But in the modern Confucians, politics and rituals and all of these are not, well, in Xiong Shili and Yang Shuming certainly, they're not as central to the Confucian tradition as you would think. No, it becomes purely an idealist tradition. And I think, again, yeah, part of the goal is to purify Confucianism at this level. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks.
Yeah.
So I yield my time.
Very good question. Yeah, sorry. And yeah. We can talk a bit more later about all of this, I'm sure.
Sure.
Thank you very much, Adi and Philippe, for your very insightful discussion. And we can now welcome Abigail Wang. She's a postdoctoral researcher at the Department of Philosophy at East China Normal University. Her research focuses on modern reconstructions of early Chinese thought, with a particular interest in how Taoist philosophy was reframed by Chinese intellectuals in the early 20th century. She applies discourse analysis and micro-historical methods to explore the transformation of classical traditions into modern academic disciplines. Her work has appeared in journals such as Contemporary Chinese Thought, Asian Studies, Dao, a journal of comparative philosophy, and Philosophy East and West. Welcome and thank you for being here as a discussion. The floor is yours and you have 20 minutes in total for your response.
Thank you, Alicia, for your introduction. And first of all, congratulations, Philippe, on this publication of your Confucian Iconoclasm. It's been such a pleasure to see this project evolve, and I feel lucky to have been part of this journey in a small way, as you kindly noted in the acknowledgements. Reading the final version, I was deeply impressed by how sharply you argue, argue the textual. Sorry. But anyway, it's just I'm very impressed by how elegantly it reframes figures like Liang Shuming and Xiong Shili within this broader field of Republican discourse. And I was especially inspired by your methodological commitment to discourse analysis, how you shift the focus away from abstract philosophical coherence and authorial intention and towards the way this text operates within the contested field of authority and legitimacy. That approach has stayed with me and shaped the way I think about intellectual history more broadly. And the idea of Confucian iconoclasm as a discursive strategy is particularly compelling, not simply a rejection of the past, but a reworking of tradition into something that authoritizes itself through its own undoing. And that paradoxical dynamic tradition, that paradoxical dynamic tradition claiming legitimacy by discarding much of what it came before raises so many questions about cultural authority, authorship, and historical rupture, both in the Republican era and potentially today. And I've jotted down actually 5 general questions that came to mind while reading. My first question is, you argue that your focus is not on Liang Shuming or Xiong Shili as thinkers, but rather on Eastern and Western cultures and the new treatise as discursive objects shaped by their socio-historical field. Still, I wonder why these 2 texts in particular. And you also mentioned that they were relatively successful and retrospective sources of authority. And there were other texts that tried to reclaim or reinvent Confucian discourse. What is it about these 2 texts that drew you to focus on them so closely? And was there something in their structure, tone, or strategy that made them feel especially emblematic of what you call Confucian iconoclasm? And the second question is, given that the book is grounded in close textual analysis, I wonder how you view the role of the author's personal experiences or broader intellectual trajectories. And by focusing so exclusively on the texts themselves, do you see the biographical or historical background of Liang Shuming and Xiong Shili as less relevant to interpreting the meaning and function of their arguments? And my third question is, you describe these 2 works as engaging in their own form of iconoclasm, one that ends up monopolizing and redefining the tradition it claims to preserve. And I'd love to hear more about what you think their attempt of anti-tradition means for us today. We can certainly see the echoes of this dynamic in contemporary debates about culture and intellectual authority. But do you think that this strategy still works? And what weight do these 2 texts carry for us contemporary readers? My fourth question is, in chapter 2, you mentioned that Xiong Shili agreed with Hu Shi that intellectuals ought to focus less on 主义 and more on 问题. But the new treatise is anything but concrete, and it's highly abstract. And in my view, that even Hu Shi, while championing the value of problem-based thinking, himself was also deeply engaged in system building and scholarly reconstructions. So my question is, how should we understand this apparent contradiction? And was the focus on concrete problems more of a rhetorical posture within the May 4th discourse? And my final question is a big and very general one, and it's purely out of curiosity. What do you think were the most compelling or attractive elements of the May 4th discourse that allowed it to gain such epistemic dominance? Why do you think it became so persuasive that even those who tried to resist it had to work within this terms? And thanks again for sharing this work. I'm excited to hear your thoughts.
Thank you, Abigail. That's a lot of questions that I'll try to answer in the brief time that is allotted. I'll try to do my best, but they are all very good questions. So I'll go in the order that you mentioned them. So let's begin with the death of the author. And also I appeal to the notion of the death of the author, essentially as Foucault means it in the introduction, to legitimize the fact that I focus on texts rather than authors. So why these two particular texts? Sorry, that was the first question. Then the death of the author is the second question. Sorry. Yeah, why these two particular texts? Well, my argument is that essentially these were the two most successful texts that presented themselves as Confucian and as philosophical during the Republican period, in terms of their readership, but also in terms of how they have been received historically since then. No, so, and this matters to me in a sense that I am interested in what can be successfully, argued in opposition to the May 4th period in the the May 4th movement in the Republican period. No? So that's one of my main goals in a sense, because in a sense, the book is also about May 4th. And one thing that I regret about the title is that May 4th should be in the title, I think, in a sense that by looking at the scope of counter-hegemonic possibilities in modern Confucianism, we get a sense of how much May 4th did manage to achieve a hegemonic purchase on the intellectual milieu, at least of the elites in Beijing and in the main sort of cities at the time in China. No, so the goal is also to rethink May 4th by looking outside at the modern Confucians, if you will, and to do that, we need to see. Yeah, my goal is to see what could be successfully argued against May 4th at the time, let's say. And the idea is that essentially, if you wanted to oppose May 4th from a Confucian perspective, you had to adopt so much of May 4th discursive techniques, including iconoclasm and teleological history and the idea of individual autonomy, that, at some point it became almost impossible to oppose May 4th in the sense that your discourse became so close to that of May 4th. So that's why I focus on these two texts. And the biographical accounts, that's a difficult one, frankly. I mean, I'm not completely, so the second question was about whether, biographical accounts can help us understand the text or not. That's a difficult one. I'm not completely against the idea of biographical accounts, frankly. I'm not a hard follower of the death of the author, let's say. The reason why I appeal to the death of the author in this book is that, frankly, the scholarship in the field of modern Confucian studies is very individual focused now. So it's usually about this author or this thinker and this philosopher. So part of the goal, really, frankly, of the death of the author was to just take a different approach, different perspective on these texts, and think of what the texts themselves were doing in the discursive milieu of the time without necessarily appealing to what the authors intended to do. Because sometimes, what we're doing in a text and what we intend to do are two very different things. And both of them should be able to be discussed. Although, frankly, the intentions of the author are very difficult to reconstruct. So that's also why I tend to take a distance from the figure of the author. But I'm not completely against the biographical account. Xiongshili was an actual literal iconoclast in his youth, going around Buddhist temple and smashing statues. So certainly that might, give you an idea of his temperament, and it might certainly have impacted his understanding of Confucianism. Having said that, the very fact that you can think that his iconoclasm was impacted by his biography, but the reason why his book became so popular and so successful, let's say, is linked to the historical period as well. And also you have to certainly supplement the biographical account with an account that is more contextual, I would argue. So I'm not sure that's a great answer, frankly, but that's that's my take. What is the stake? What is the status of sort of anti-tradition in today's China? That's a difficult one, but certainly, I mean, I can maybe try to answer question 3 and 5 together, in a sense that I have a project that I would like to work on, which is about the Mayfort movement itself. And that would be a third book, hopefully, if I ever manage to finish the second one. And that would be about, I guess, what it is that made the Mayfort so popular, I guess, the discourse, the iconoclastic discourse of Mayfort so popular. And I think part of the answer is that there was a vacuum at the time in the 1910s and early 20s in terms of what were the rules of social distinction in academia. And I think Mayfort allowed for new rules to be implemented whereby essentially you could establish your authority based on your representation of authoritative Euro-American knowledge in China. Matthew Chu, a sociologist in Hong Kong, actually has an interesting article where he argues that in China throughout the 20th century, there's quite a lot of intellectual value to be accumulated by playing this role of representing the West in China, if you will, because there is a popularity, let's say in the 1980s, there's a great thirst for knowledge about the West. So if you manage to present yourself as, let's say, someone who manages to interpret Western cultural products for a Chinese audience, that will give you quite a bit of authority in the intellectual milieu, And I think that's what Mayfort does very successfully, if you will. And it allows also other intellectuals outside of the hegemonic center in Beijing, let's say, to present themselves as also representatives of Mayfort, let's say in Taiwan. Now, there is a journal in Taiwan at the time called also, what is it called? Sorry, I forgot. But it's very close to Mayfort in terms of thinking. It's also anti-Japanese colonialism, from what I remember. And some people who write in this journal are trying to present themselves as the local representative of Mayfort in Taiwan. So in a sense, Mayfort provides the sort of discursive toolkit to establish your authority, outside of the sort of Beijing center, if you will. So that is part of what makes Mayfort so compelling. And I think, one amazing development in contemporary China is precisely the challenge to Mayfort that you see in the Kangdang group, in the sort of New Confucian, the mainland New Confucian group, who are challenging Mayfort and are trying to go back to Xiaowei. And I think, this has been discussed in terms of epistemic nativism and all of that, but I think if we think of Mayfort as a group that, sought to achieve epistemic hegemony in the Chinese intellectual milieu, then you can understand a bit better why these Chinese intellectuals would want to oppose Mayfort. Not in terms of just opposing Western knowledge altogether, but in terms of opposing the hegemonic purchase of the use of Western knowledge in the Chinese intellectual milieu. So that would be, I think, an interesting approach to these figures associated with the mainland New Confucians. I don't know if I have time for the fourth question. Alice would be the
Yes, please. You can totally answer. I think we still have enough time.
Good. Thank you so much. I mean, frankly, the fourth question was about Xiongshili and Hushi, Xiongshili focusing on problem rather than Zhuyi. Frankly, maybe it's been a bit too long since I wrote the book. I don't remember mentioning that in the book. So I'm not sure I can speak to that, frankly.
You probably didn't say that he agreed with the full sentence, not isms, but Wenti. But you did mention that he also agrees with Hushi that he should focus more on concrete problems. I just assumed that you meant Zhuyi and Wenti.
Yeah. Yeah, it's highly possible. Well, certainly, I mean, Xiongshili is, I think, writing these books, if we're going to talk about authorial intention, with the goal of, enlightening the Chinese people to some extent. No, I think, like many Chinese intellectuals at the time, he's trying to, find solutions for China, but in this case, in a very idealist way, by focusing purely on, enlightenment through a sort of Confucian Buddhist syncretism, no? So there is a sense in which he is focusing on problems, but yeah, you're right to say that he does so at such an abstract level that it's hard to sometimes remember that he has specific problems in mind, which is essentially the fact that Chinese people are divorced, let's say, from the kind of Confucian culture that he has in mind, I would say. Yeah. So in that sense, certainly he focuses more on problems. And yeah, Zhuyi, frankly, he also doesn't focus very much on Zhuyi. He doesn't really focus also on Western theories in his book. And I think there's a performative dimension to that, in terms that he's trying to present himself really as on the side of Chinese, Confucian especially, culture, as opposed to Western culture, of course. But also, yeah, I think he's trying to present his Confucianism as authentic precisely by not focusing too much on Western philosophy, although he mentions it from time to time, but mostly just to say that Western philosophers fail to achieve the kind of knowledge that you have in Xuanshui, as he defines it, a sort of metaphysics that is Confucian in character and opposed to Western philosophy, I guess. So yeah, in that sense, you can think of him as going against the focus on Zhuyi at the time. If you think of Zhuyi in terms of liberalism and democracy and communism and socialism, yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks to you. Yeah.
Thank you, Abigail, and thank you, Philippe, for this very interesting angle for the discussion. And now our last discussant is Professor Selusi Ambrogio, is an assistant professor of Chinese studies at the University of Macerata, where he's currently teaching Chinese literature, Chinese culture, and the history of Chinese thought. He is also serving as the president of the European Association for Chinese Philosophy, and his areas of expertise are Neo-Confucianism and contemporary Neo-Confucianism in comparative perspective, environmental intercultural philosophy, history of early Orientalism, contemporary literary criticism, and historiography of philosophy. He published many articles in international journals, and is also the author of two monographs, Chinese and Indian Ways of Thinking in Early Modern European Philosophy, The Reception and the Exclusion, published by Bloomsbury in 2020, and Casa da Te di Lausche, Il testo, il contesto e la serie TV, published by Bonomo Editor in 2020. Together with David Rogax, He was also the general editor for the 3-volume collection on the history of Chinese philosophy, titled Chinese Philosophy and Its Thinkers from Ancient Times to the Present Day, which was published in November 2024 by Bloomsbury. So welcome, Selusi, and thank you so much for being here. We are looking forward to this discussion. The floor is yours, and you have a total of 20 minutes for your response, which will leave us with around 25 minutes for the Q&A.
So thank you very much, Alice, for your presentation. And I want to thank Paul for having me here today, since he didn't know that I knew Philippe. So it was really a nice chance to have the possibility to participate in today's discussion. So first of all, congratulations, Philippe. We have been talking about this monograph in Glasgow, if I'm not wrong, a few years ago, and now we are here. So it's very good, very nice to be here. I want to say that I have the hard copy of your book, since when I was a reviewer for Sunny, I think last year, so in 24, it was the first monograph that I asked as complimentary copy. So just to have your monograph. So I wanted the hard copy version of your, and not a digital version of your book, since I want to have a close reading of it and not just reading digitally. So I start from a few considerations about the general work. So this monograph, from my point of view, has extraordinary merits. It challenges historiographical assumptions that tend to systematize and simplify an exceptionally vital and chaotic, we might say, period of Chinese intellectual history. To radically question the assumption of a first generation of new Confucians is necessary for a number of reasons. You also raise this point in the chapter that she has written for the third volume of Chinese Philosophy and Its Thinkers. So I can just say to people who want to know more to go to that chapter connected to your book. First, the reasons for which it is very, very important in what you've done is that this is a retrospective construction. So the idea of the first generation is just a retrospective construction intending to legitimize a generation composed largely of exiles from the newly established People's Republic of China. Second, it fails, so this definition, it fails to reflect the conflicted state in which the thought of thinkers such as Liang Shuming and Xiong Shili emerged, along with deep internal divisions and contradictions, as well as the complete absence of a corporate or collective spirit among them. Each was a giant within his own intellectual empire. The quintessential sage, as more or less you said in your chapters, an attitude partly continued by the second generation representatives. Third, the definition of a first generation suggests these authors were opposed to modernity and lacked engagement with the May 4th movement and emergent communist thought, and this is completely inaccurate, as you demonstrate and you show in your monograph. It is precisely on this point that Major's work makes its most indispensable contribution. Through close reading of great refinement, really, this is a great refined close reading, the text shows how both the Mayfair thinkers and these so-called traditionalists were in fact grappling with the same paradigm, facing in some ways the same adversary. In this sense, especially in its outstanding introduction and conclusion, which I might say are highly usable for teaching purposes at undergrad level on their own, so just introduction, the conclusion, are already a very intelligent contribution, the text also helps us better understand the Mayforth authors themselves. And that's precisely what you've just said, saying I wanted, if I could write again the title of the monograph, I would add Mayforth. And that was my perception too, while reading the text, that this was a text on the Mayforth authors at the same time as on the wrongly said first generation. So the Mayforth authors themselves, who were not necessarily dedicated to abandoning their culture or blindly embracing the West, although often they did so. Both sides were using the new tools, we might say the new tools of philosophy, imported from the West, namely the universalistic logical rational structures and the academic institutionalization. Major effectively highlights how, in this clash, the search for identity and role within the newly imposed cultural landscape becomes evident. Regarding the close reading developed in the chapter and the definition of the figure of the sage more than of wisdom, so of the sages, really, since each one of them wanted to be the sage, so the one and only, the monograph offers an exceptional training ground for future researchers. So I was really reading your book with the teaching perspective too, at the same time, who can draw excellent insights from this approach. That said, I have a few general observations to raise to the author, and maybe this is something that we will discuss in the next years and not just today. Personally, I find the eternalization, and this is something that we raised in the questions already. I find the eternalization, we might say, of Confucius and the role of the sage a classical hallmark of Chinese thought. The paradigm of tradition as history, as you use this dual definition, so tradition as history and tradition as value, can be traced throughout the whole Chinese historiographical tradition, both Confucian, Neo-Confucian, and Buddhist. During various periods of crisis or rupture in Chinese history, although the idea that the true Tao Tong had not been transmitted is very classical one. The abstraction of tradition from its historical sequence is, in my view, not a novelty of this generation, but can be read in the concept of 不传, so on not transmission, from Han Yu to Zhu Xi and from Wang Yanming to Wang Fuzhi, which defines tradition as value in their historiographies or in their work more than tradition as history in their work. Tradition as history, this is really my point of view, so this is my perspective. Tradition as history, which in Western culture is constructed through 18th, 19th century historicism, holds less value in the cyclical historiographical culture of China. So I'm not surprised that these authors, in line with the tradition they represent, support a tradition as value perspective. Of course, they express a clear rejection of many aspects of tradition as history, particularly the social aspects, the injustice, etc. But even this can be found in a very, we might say, modern author like Wang Fuzhi. I also stress that contemporary tradition and the canonization process of texts are themselves expression of tradition as value more than tradition as history. And the construction of a tradition built upon a single text, which then rises the status of tradition or new tradition, is typical in Buddhist historiography. So this idea of one text is the text, the one and only, because the Buddhists could not claim in any way a tradition as history in the Chinese context. In my view, this somewhat calls into question a bit the iconoclastic status of these authors, or at least raise the problem of the iconoclastic nature of Confucianism or of Chinese tradition in general. So in the whole, not just in that period. And I need to thank your work for letting me think about this the tradition, the Chinese tradition, as iconoclastic somehow in this way. So this is the contribution that it makes to my reflection. We might say that there are different iconoclastic traditions or periods in Chinese history, although. So this is my first point about the term iconoclasm and the dualism, tradition as history, tradition as values, which in my view, tradition as history is very Western as a concept and does not really apply very well to Chinese tradition. The second point, the text rightly highlights the contention with the May 4th movement very well, I might say. In my view, it does not always clearly define, often referring to McKeham's work, what the battleground actually was, since being a close reading of texts, it set aside the question of the battleground. Both sides wanted to monopolize the field, but often it is the field itself that produces or forces the content of the text. In Europe, the system of philosophy, as I used to name it, following Brucker, structured within a clear academic framework, defines the place of Chinese philosophical thought and relegates it outside the field, into and elsewhere a space of weakness of the mind. And the claim to wisdom in opposition to reason is an extraordinary contribution these authors offer, reworking the tradition they represent within a framework of universalization. I therefore wonder whether, alongside the extraordinarily valuable close reading, it might also be necessary to carry out a study of the impact of the Western lens, one that we might describe as Orientalist, on those authors. The battleground, after all, is not constituted solely of the new discipline, so of the scientific sense of philosophy, but also by how and where the Chinese tradition itself has been defined and marginalized. And the field then is shaped not only by Western universality, but also by the exclusion of the Chinese tradition. So I find that this section of the exclusion is less strong as it might be. You are doing something like this in a more recent article, this is Structural Eurocentrism in Philosophy. No, as you might know, I do not agree on everything it has written, but I see the work in really the problem of the exclusion. So the role of the exclusion. So you might even answer with an article that I read after writing down my notes. So just in those days. My third point, I wonder why, this is an easier one as a question. I wonder why I've written the author, but I might say you, Philippe, completely avoid any reference to a very well-known paradigm, at least discussing it. There is the paradigm of 重体喜用. Since you never use it now in your monograph, I'm certain that this is done on purpose. So I want to know in a clear way why you did so. And I might agree maybe with you, but I'm curious of knowing better this, because I was thinking about the fortune of this expression in Chinese tradition in authors that are played with 重体喜用, for example, Li Zihou. We use it, just reworked it in a novel way, but you completely avoid the term. And so why? The last point is more something that really interested me while reading. You write on page 176, you write, this type of operation allows the text to present its own brand of Confucianism as supplementing. So I use supplementing. Rather than supplanting the modern West as a universal future filled in with May 4th content. And this is a very nice sentence. I love this sentence. And I particularly appreciate this sentence since the expression supplementing and supplanting are two expressions that has already been used in the Western China relation, though, since precisely these two expressions were used by Xu Guanqi to represent and to describe Matteo Ricci's work as a Jesuit rereading classic tradition in China, and they were using precisely these two terms in Chinese. And so this is somehow fascinating that you are still using the same two terms to understand this relation between West and China that have been used in the late Ming time. So thank you very much for your attention, Philippe, and I'm eager to listen to you.
Thank you so much, Selusi, for really thought-provoking thoughts and questions, and I'll try my best to answer them as I can. I was not aware, of this. Well, you're the specialist on the Jesuits and on the sort of Western perception also of Chinese philosophy. So I was not aware of this Jesuit use. So yeah, thanks for mentioning this. This is quite interesting. Much more to talk about, I think, later together. Well, okay, let me go back to the first question. That's an interesting question that, I think you hit the nail on the head, that this is a tension within the text that I have very much, which is that I call this form of Confucianism iconoclastic. But of course, the problem is that I do recognize the fact that iconoclasm is a part of the Confucian tradition as well, no? So that means that certainly it's not the case that the texts reject everything that's in Confucianism, in the sense that they do adopt discursive techniques from the long history of Confucianism, even if they reject that long history, if you will, in the case of Yang Shuming, no? And I struggled with how to explain this, but essentially I came up, I don't quite remember the terminologies anymore, but I think I have something like discursive anti-traditions, which mean that you have a sort of anti-tradition that is part of Confucian discourse throughout history, and that is adopted by both texts. Part of what I argue is that the texts use discursive techniques borrowed from Mayfort in order to oppose Mayfort. But my argument is not that these discursive techniques are solely from Mayfort. They're also, I think, some of them inherited from Buddhist and Confucian sources. And this means that, their iconoclasm is not full, if you will. Now, I think we have to distinguish between what the text argues, and what the texts argue is quite iconoclastic, no? The discourse of the text itself. But then it's true that the discursive techniques of the text are inherited from the past, and in this sense, at a discursive level, the texts are not quite as fully as iconoclastic as you might imagine, if you will. And in fact, that's part of what I try to argue in the conclusion, is that, in fact, the texts are trying to reshape the sort of rules of intellectual distinction through the production of text by essentially deploying partially traditional discursive techniques, if you will, including that of iconoclasm, which I regard as something that was also present in Confucianism throughout history, if you will. So that's a complex answer, but essentially, I regard the text as, iconoclastic in terms of how they portray Confucianism, but not quite as iconoclastic in terms of how much they inherit discursive techniques from the discursive tradition of Confucianism, if you will. But I agree with you that certainly throughout history, tradition as value or is certainly central to the Taotong discourse. Certainly, this and I do discuss in the book quite a bit Taotong. Not so much because the texts themselves mention Taotong, but certainly they have views of history that can be explained as Taotong, I think, very easily, especially in the case of Liang Shuming, no? So that would be, I guess, my explanation. So I agree with you that the Taotong is very iconoclastic, and tradition as value is also central to it, and all of that. Sorry, second question.
Was about the exclusion of Chinese philosophy. So
Yeah.
how the exclusion impacted. I
Yeah.
might just add a very short point to what you said. We might say, so this is a question again, a question within the question. Might we say that Confucian, so the Confucians you are working on were iconoclastic towards the West, while the May 4th movement was iconoclastic toward Chinese tradition?
Well, I would argue that the texts that I deal with are iconoclastic both towards the West to some extent. Yang Shiming much less than Xiongshi. In fact, Xiongshi doesn't have much to say about, well, he says a few things about Western philosophy as sort of inferior, no? So in this sense, yeah, you could think of him as iconoclastic towards the West as well. But I also think that they're iconoclastic towards
Their
Chinese
tradition, yeah.
traditions as well as they were established in history. I think that's still a valid call, despite the fact that they do inherit quite a bit from Chinese discourses, Confucian discourses, and Buddhist discourses, no?
No, I agree.
But that inheritance, that's the thing, is that that's also part of their idealism, is that the only thing that they see of value in Confucianism and Buddhism is purely discursive in some sense. No? There's not much material value there, and that's part of their argument, I guess, and part of their desire to purify Confucianism, as I mentioned earlier. Now, yeah, the second question is really about my second project, which you're right that I could have also reframed Confucian iconoclasm around the central question of essentially the hegemony of Western philosophical knowledge production that the texts would challenge. And certainly that's central to what the texts are doing. And I do discuss that a bit in the book, but I frame it more as an opposition to Mayfort, with Mayfort representing in China, you know, Western philosophical knowledge, if you will, no? And I think I would certainly hold on to that description, meaning that I think that the main opponents here are really the Mayfort figures, and the West is, you know, part of the picture, but you know, the West is a distant figure in a sense for both Liang and Xiong. No, I mean it's still very much present, of course, in China discursively and you know through imperialism, of course. But I would argue that the main opponents of Yang and Xiong are really the Mayfort group, and the West is still central here in the sense that the West plays an important role in how the Mayfort achieves intellectual distinction and authority, right? So it's at this level that certainly we could study a bit more how Xiong and Liang both try to oppose the hegemony of Western knowledge. I do think they're trying to do that, but first and foremost in opposition to Mayfort. But it's true that, you know, John Maycam has discussed quite a bit also how Xiong's book is an answer to the issue of the so-called lack of systematicity of Chinese philosophy that was first highlighted by Japanese scholars and then was very much integrated in the Chinese discourse in the 1910s in China and all that. Chinese philosophy, yeah, maybe it's good, but it lacks the systematicity of a Hegel or a Kant, right? That's a very common criticism at the time. And Xiong is trying to precisely provide a system for Confucianism. But that is interesting because it's very much in tension with the fact that Xiong argues that the very problem with Western philosophy is this focus, is this trust in philosophical discourse, if you will, no? Which he argues, you know, Eastern traditions, Buddhism, but mostly Confucianism, are superior insofar as they don't trust language and discourse quite as much. But precisely by focusing so much on systematicity and all of that, it does sound like there's a tension between the form of the texts, is what I argue in the conclusion of the new treatise, and its content, which argues against the primacy of system and language, if you will. But you're right, yeah, that there's these tensions in a sense are the result of very colonial and imperial relations between China and the West that are represented at the level of thought, I would think. It's just that in this book, I study them in terms of the Mayford versus the Mayford versus Confucian iconoclasts relation. But yeah, in my second book, I will focus more on the so-called second generation, Tang Junyi especially, and maybe Mo Zongsan as well, and how they are also trying to oppose the hegemony of Western knowledge production. But it is very difficult, of course, in an intellectual milieu that has adopted Western standards as to what good philosophy is supposed to look like, for example. No? So you have these tensions in their thought as well.
Western language, not only Western standard.
Yeah, you're right. Yeah.
Western language.
Yeah, they use a lot of also, parentheses with the English, but also neologisms that are borrowed from Western languages. Yeah. So that's something that I will work on more in the future, certainly. Yeah. I don't have a very good answer to your question about Zhongti Xiyong, frankly. It wasn't intentional to simply avoid discussing Zhongti Xiyong. Yeah. I'm not sure. I mean, there's a bit of both texts certainly don't discuss Zhang Zhidong and the whole sort of discussion on Zhongti Xiyong. From what I remember, maybe Liang Shiming mentions it in the introduction. I don't quite remember. But certainly the very fact that this was regarded as a sort of late Qing dynasty discourse would have made it a bit dangerous for thinkers like Yang Shuming and Xiong Shuli to present their thought as somehow akin to Zhongti Xiyong in a sense that, it would have made it look a bit dated, if you will, no? So there's that. There's also, of course, the question of whether we as scholars can present their thought as Zhongti Xiyong. I'm not sure if that's what you were also aiming at. I'm not sure if you could fully do that, perhaps with Yang Shuming to some extent, in the sense that Western culture is purely material, no? According to him, no, it will resolve material issues. So it seems very focused on Yang, while Chinese culture is much more spiritual in a sense, in the realm of thought also, so that there's something more tea about this, given that Yang Shuming is an idealist, right? So yeah, I would have to think some more about that, frankly speaking. Yeah.
Thank you so much. And we are left with around 20 minutes for the Q&A. So if anyone in the public has any question for Philippe or for one of our discussants, please.
Daniel Bell wrote an interesting comment about Xunzi being the first iconoclast in the Confucian tradition. That might be the case, although Xunzi also does elevate the old sages, the sage kings, to quite a high status, in the sense that they are the ones who invented the rituals that enable us to become moral, because morality is, of course, completely social and not innate and natural in human nature, and therefore, in fact, you could also think of Xunzi as elevating the sage kings to even a higher level than they were in Mencius, in the sense that they single-handedly produced morality out of essentially nothing, right? So, but it's true that there's also an iconoclastic dimension to Xunzi in regards to Mencius, certainly.
I don't know if Daniel wants to intervene on this, on his comment, or if Philippe already provided a satisfactory answer to that.
But there's often a tension in Confucianism between appeal to tradition and iconoclasm, certainly.
If there are no other questions from the audience so far, maybe Philippe, if you would like to go back to the small part of your presentation that you missed in the beginning, while maybe people think of it if they still have any question.
Sure. Yeah, let me try to see if I cannot share my slides again. Yeah, that's the more sort of continental philosophy bit of the book, if you will, where I draw from Ernesto Laclau and Judith Butler, yeah, to distinguish between these two different types of counter-hegemonic projects. Because I portray, Confucian iconoclasm as a counter-hegemonic project opposed to the epistemic hegemony of Mayford, essentially, and I try to make sense of what type of counter-hegemonic project it is. I highlight these two different types, the intrinsic type, whereby you use the established rules set by the hegemon to marginalize it, and the extrinsic type, you try to challenge the very rules of the hegemon. And I use an example from Judith Butler, where she argues, I think the reference is right here, yeah, in this book written with Zizek and Laclau, Contingency, Hegemony, and Universality, She argues that an example of the first, the intrinsic counter-hegemonic type would be, let's say, same-sex couples arguing for same-sex marriage. And also, in dealing with the issue of marriage, essentially, you have two main ways that you can oppose a sort of heteronormative hegemony on marriage. Let's say one would be to say that well, same-sex marriage should exist. So you use the concept of marriage used by the hegemonic group in order to marginalize the hegemonic group, if you will. But another approach, which is essentially promoted by Butler and usually preferred by Zizek also, and these figures, is to challenge the very institution of marriage itself as heteronormative true and true, and we should therefore reject marriage. So these are the two different ways that you could oppose, let's say, a hegemonic group. Now, on the face of it, it seems like Confucian iconoclasm would be a counter-hegemonic project of the first type, in the sense that it does adopt some discursive tropes from Mayford. Now, certainly the discursive trope of iconoclasm, but also teleological history, individual autonomy as well, in the case of Xiongshili. All of these seem to suggest that what we're dealing with here is an intrinsic counter-hegemonic project. But I also argue that their goal is ultimately also to challenge the rules of discursivity at the time, in a sense that they're trying to replace the authority of the West in Mayford discourse by the authority of the figure of the Confucian sage who has access to absolute truth, and which is monopolized and sort of embodied by the figure of the author in both texts. So in the end, the texts are as hegemonic, at least in terms of their goals, not in actuality, but in terms of their goals, they're as hegemonic as Mayford in the sense that they are really trying to entirely monopolize intellectual commodities that are associated with human emancipation by presenting their authors as the only true sages of modern China. And in fact, historically, we know that Yang Shuming and Xiongshili were relatively close to one another, but also quite critical of one another because they tended to see themselves as the main, sage of their times. Yeah. And I think this is one example that shows how we should be careful in how we handle alternative epistemologies, the whole discussion around alternative epistemologies tend to suggest that there's something inherently valuable and better in alternative epistemologies at time. But certainly there are cases in which you can have alternative epistemologies, such as the case of Confucian iconoclasm, I would argue, where the alternative epistemology is as hegemonic, at least in potential, as the dominant epistemology. And that doesn't mean we shouldn't criticize, of course, Eurocentric epistemic hegemony in Mayford discourse, for example, but we should be also aware of the fact that the Confucian iconoclast alternative seems quite also hegemonic, at least in potential. So that's all I had to say, actually. It's not much. Yeah.
Yes, thank you, Philip. It's a very interesting remark and an interesting connection to like also contemporary continental philosophy that I was really looking forward to hear because I had briefly seen your slide and I was really wondering about it. And yeah. If any of the other participant has any other question, we still have 10 minutes that we'll use for the Q&A.
Can I quickly pose another question?
Of course, of course.
I wonder if iconoclasm has always been sort of there in Confucianism, then what makes this like modern attempts special?
That is the question, I guess. I mean, what I try to do in this book is really to try to adopt a sort of historical contextualizing sort of approach, no? So I guess my answer to this would be that what makes Confucian iconoclasm unique in the Republican period is, it's its purpose, no? I mean, the purpose of Confucian iconoclasm as a discursive technique will change very much from one historical context to another, no? If you think of Wang Yangming's iconoclasm towards the Juxi sort of Daotong, the goal is very different, of course, than in the case of Confucian iconoclasm, which is the opposition to Mayfort, right? That is central, I think. So that would be my answer, I guess, is the centrality of the historical context in understanding what Confucian iconoclasm in the Republican period is about, no? So I don't think we should necessarily, we can necessarily think of Confucian iconoclasm as some universal thing that retains through time. I think it's something that emerges in answer to a historical need, let's say, and therefore we should study iconoclasm as a discursive technique in relation to that need. And in this book, I tried to do that by focusing less. Oftentimes, people who work on modern Confucianism focus on sort of large-scale issues such as modernization. No, that's a central issue in the historiography of modern Confucianism. Of course, Eurocentrism and all of these issues. State building, of course, no, these kind of issues are central, certainly, to the study of modern Confucianism in historians and philosophers alike, frankly. But in this book, I try to focus less on that larger context and focus more on the intellectual field, which I see as the more direct context in which these texts were written, meaning that they were written first and foremost to oppose certain position in the intellectual fields upheld by the Mayfort movement representatives, and not, that to me is the main context in which these texts are written, as opposed to the context of China's modernization and all of that. And certainly, if you ask Yang Shuming and Xiong Shili, I think they would say that their main aim is not necessarily the intellectual field, but it's the bigger picture, right? But we don't have to agree with them, of course, and we can read them in different contexts. Not that I'm not fully opposed to the bigger historical context. I guess my goal is to focus on a different context in this case here. And yeah, it is this context, I would think, that makes Confucian iconoclasm different, but not fully unique, yeah, certainly. So, I mean, ideally, yeah, I could see, different studies of different forms of iconoclasm throughout Chinese history taking place. I mean, that I think would be interesting, yeah, certainly.
Thank you. And we still have 5 minutes if anyone else has a last brief question for Philippe. Otherwise, I might ask a question myself. And in reading your book, I was especially impressed by the chapter on teleological history. And I noticed that at some point you briefly mentioned how the portrayal of cultures in Liang Shuming's text often kind of reproduces a variety of Orientalist tropes. And I was wondering if you could go a little into detail about that and on the relationship between that and iconoclasm.
Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, we did touch on Orientalism, but we didn't really discuss that. In fact, I wanted to mention that in Selusi's in answer to Selusi's question, but I didn't. Yeah, you're right. I point out a few Orientalist tropes, not only in both texts, perhaps more in Yang Shuming's text. Yeah, but so the distinction between so-called Oriental wisdom as opposed to Western reason is one of them. Did I say that right? Oriental wisdom versus Western reason. Yeah. Okay. Then the opposition between a West that is very sort of proactive and evolving quickly, and a China that is stagnant in Yang Shuming. That's also a very common Orientalist trope at the time. So these are two of the main ones. And I think one of the reasons why you have these Orientalist tropes being reproduced is that, well, if you are a Chinese philosopher or who is trying to argue for the value of Chinese philosophy, and I think that this is what these thinkers are trying to do, partially in opposition to Mayford, but they're trying to argue that China has something of value to offer that is unique, and therefore, it has to be different from what the West has to offer. So if you're someone like Husserl and you see that, and you say that, yeah, China too had, logic, it doesn't really, highlight anything that is unique of value in Chinese philosophy. So you have to find something outside of the scope of ideas that is occupied in the popular imagination, if you will, by Western philosophy. And that's why they tend to reproduce these tropes, I think, to present Chinese philosophy as different, focuses on wisdom and not reason, and therefore they can present it as valuable. So I think, yeah, it has very much to do with sort of Eurocentric discourse. Yeah, the fact that Chinese thinkers tend to reproduce these tropes. And you have that not just in China, but in India, of course. You also have the reproduction quite a bit of Orientalist tropes in order to legitimize local intellectual commodities, if you will, no? And that speaks to, yeah, I think the sort of colonialism that is taking place at the time in the realm of ideas, if you will.
Yes, thank you very much. And if someone has very, very brief questions in 2 minutes, you're very welcome to ask it. Otherwise, we might conclude.
I might say, yeah, I should say thank you to all of you. Really, your questions were very good, and I'm not very good at answering questions right on the spot, so I apologize for this. But the questions were very good, and I really enjoyed the exercise, and it made me think about, unfortunately, a number of things that I could have clarified in the book and made better. As always, once it's written, then you realize everything that you could have done better, which is a bit of a hard exercise. But I hope some of the things were done right. But yeah, thank you so much for all of your questions. They were all very thought-provoking. And thank you again, Paul, for organizing the book discussion, and Alice for being the guide, the host. Yeah.
Thank you so much for your presentation, and thank you everyone for all the